officers, on God, I can explain everything. It's not what it seems. It doesn't need to go beyond this. There are no ghost accounts, I promise.
The investigators already knew everything. They knew about the ghost accounts used to hide missing cash. They knew about the adoption records that had been quietly changed. They knew about the $95,000, taken slowly, carefully over 6 full years. $20 here, $30 there, sometimes $50. Always from families who handed over their cash believing every single cent was going to save an animal. More than 2,100 transactions. 6 years of clean, quiet theft. 11 animals that went without medical treatment they were supposed to receive because the budget, Luther kept saying, had simply run dry. Every thread led back to him. After a string of high-profile shelter scandals in the early 2010s, animal welfare nonprofits across the country were forced to clean up how they handled money. Donation platforms went digital. Adoption fees were set at fixed rates. Financial boards were put in place at shelters that received government funding. The Harwick County Animal Welfare Center in rural West Virginia became a model for all of it. New software, new rules, a new director position built on one simple condition, that whoever held it could be trusted without question. The audits were light. The board met 4 times a year. The financial review happened once. The loophole didn't need to be found. It was designed in. So who did Harwick County give that trust to? A man who had spent his whole life making people see exactly what he wanted them to see. If you're new here, we cover real cases, real footage, real consequences. Subscribe and hit the bell. This one does not end the way Luther Catlett planned. Pineville, West Virginia is the kind of town where everybody knows everybody, and everybody knows there isn't much. Wyoming County sits deep in the southern coal fields, tucked between hills that block out the early morning light. The county animal shelter was so small it shared its parking lot with a weekend farmer's market. Folding tables of vegetables on one side, dogs waiting for homes on the other. That's where Luther Catlett grew up. His mother, Dervla, was a licensed veterinary technician who brought her work home in the most literal way possible, fostering sick animals in the spare bathroom, keeping medications in the kitchen fridge, talking about animal care the way other mothers talked about cooking. His father worked the mines for years, quiet and steady, until his back finally gave out in 2001, and the family learned what it felt like to stretch every dollar until it tore. Luther watched all of it, and somewhere in that watching, something took root. By the time he was 14, he was logging 60 volunteer hours a month at the McDowell County shelter. Nobody assigned him there. Nobody pushed him through the door. He simply showed up, week after week, and did whatever needed doing. Cleaning kennels, socializing scared dogs, sitting with animals that had been there so long they'd stopped expecting anyone to come. Then at 16, he did something that got people's attention. A litter of 5 puppies came in, showing the signs of parvovirus, a disease that moves fast and kills faster. 3 different vets looked at them and said the same thing: don't waste the resources. The odds weren't there, but Luther asked to try. He followed a strict care routine around the clock, tracking temperatures, managing hydration, doing the slow and unglamorous work of keeping 5 tiny animals alive hour by hour. All 5 survived. The local paper sent someone to take a photo. Luther is grinning in it, a teenager who looks like he hasn't slept properly in 2 weeks, which he probably hadn't. The puppies are piled on his chest like they own him. The headline called him a natural. He carried that momentum straight into West Virginia University, where he earned an animal science degree and was accepted into the school's elite shelter management concentration, one of only 4 students chosen that year. His senior thesis was titled Donation Transparency and Public Trust in Municipal Animal Welfare Nonprofits. Hold on to that title. It matters. After graduation, Luther climbed steadily through the regional animal welfare world. His work was careful, passionate, and noticed by the right people. By the time he was 29, the Appalachian Animal Welfare Coalition named him their Regional Volunteer Coordinator of the Year, the youngest person in the award's history to receive it. People in the industry started saying his name the way they say the names of people headed somewhere important. Then the coalition went through a restructuring. Budgets were cut. Positions were eliminated. His was one of them. Just like that, the path he had spent 15 years building came to a dead end. The dream didn't close the way he'd planned. There was no ceremony, no graceful exit, no next chapter already written. There was just Luther Catlett, 30 years old, highly skilled, deeply trusted, and suddenly without a place to put any of it. What he did next changed everything. In 2014, the Harwick County Animal Welfare Center was looking for someone to their shelter into a new era. They needed a director, someone with real experience, genuine passion, and the kind of reputation that made donors feel good about writing checks. They posted the position and waited to see who would apply. Luther Catlett applied, and from the moment he walked into that interview room, the job was essentially his. Orsolia Fenwick, who chaired the hiring committee, later sat down with investigators and tried to explain what made Luther so different from every other candidate they saw. She said it plainly. Luther understood the emotional architecture of donor relationships better than anyone I'd ever interviewed. He knew exactly how to make people feel like their $25 adoption fee was changing the world. She wasn't wrong about that. Not even a little. Within his first 3 years, Luther grew the shelter's annual donations by 34%. Adoption rates climbed to levels the center had never recorded before. He launched a program called Second Chance Sunday, one free adoption day per month, that brought families in from across the region and kept the shelter's name in local newspapers for months at a time. People started driving in from 4 counties over because Harwick had something most shelters didn't, a feeling. The feeling that the place was run by someone who genuinely cared. The board loved him. County officials pointed to him as an example of how local nonprofits should be run. Volunteers stayed longer than they had under any previous director. Staff turnover dropped. The credentials followed naturally. Luther earned his Certified Nonprofit Administrator designation. He was appointed to the State Animal Welfare Board. In 2017, West Virginia Living magazine featured him in a full profile. The headline read, "The Man Who Never Gave Up on Them." There was a photo of Luther kneeling in one of the dog runs, a large mixed breed resting its head on his knee. He looked completely at home. And with all of that, the titles, the recognition, the trust that had been building year after year, came something very specific. Luther was given sole processing authority over all walk-in adoption fee transactions. No second signature needed for any amount under $500. The board reviewed financials once a year. Internal audits were light and infrequent. The assumption, shared by everyone on that board, was simple. A man this dedicated, this decorated, this loved by his community, did not need to be watched closely. That assumption was the open door. He had spent 8 years earning the exact access he would eventually use against the very people who gave it to him. Not through pressure or manipulation, but through genuine, visible, undeniable excellence. The awards were real. The donation growth was real. The families whose lives were made better by Second Chance Sunday were real. That's the part that makes this case so difficult to sit with. Because Luther Catlett wasn't pretending to be good at his job. He actually was. For 8 full years, he was everything Harwick County wanted him to be. Then, somewhere quietly, without any single dramatic moment to point to, he decided to become something else entirely. To understand how Luther Catlett stole $95,000 from a nonprofit animal shelter over 6 years without triggering a single alarm, you first need to understand how the money was supposed to move. Harwick County's donation platform was modern and clean on the digital side. When someone paid an adoption fee with a card, the transaction was processed automatically. A receipt was generated instantly. The amount was logged with a timestamp tied to the adopter's name and stored in the system without anyone needing to touch it. It was airtight. Cash was different. When a family walked in and paid their adoption fee with physical money, that payment had to be recorded by hand. The director wrote it into a ledger. The ledger was reviewed by the board once a year. There was no second person in the room to confirm the amount. No camera pointed at the intake desk. No automatic receipt printed for the family unless they specifically asked for one. Most people didn't ask. Luther didn't hack a single system. He didn't create fake employees or forge withdrawal documents. He didn't do anything that required technical skill or elaborate planning. He simply started recording certain cash payments as pending in the ledger, an ambiguous status that implied the transaction was still being processed, and slipped the physical bills into his own pocket before they ever reached the deposit envelope. The first transaction investigators were able to confirm happened on March 7th, 2018. A mother came in that Saturday afternoon with her 2 daughters. They had already picked out the dog online, a 3-year-old beagle mix listed on the shelter's website under the name Captain. They filled out the paperwork, paid $60 in cash, and left with Captain in the back seat, probably arguing about who got to hold the leash first. Luther logged $35. He kept $25. When investigators later asked him to describe what that moment felt like, the first time he took money that wasn't his answer, recorded in testimony, was this: like nothing. It felt like nothing. That's the part that should stay with you. Not the number, not the method, the feeling. Because a person who feels nothing the first time they steal from grieving, hopeful, animal-loving families is a person who is going to do it again and again. Over the next 6 weeks, Luther ran the same move 11 more times. The amounts he kept ranged from $15 to $50. Never a round number large enough to stand out. Always cash transactions, always on weekends, when the volunteer staff rotated and no one person was watching the front desk consistently enough to notice patterns. By the end of those first 6 weeks, he had taken a total of $387. He used it to pay a car insurance bill, not a vacation, not jewelry, not anything that could be pointed to later as a sign that something was wrong, just a bill. The most ordinary possible use of stolen money, which meant there was nothing on the surface to see. The scheme had started, it had worked, no one had noticed, no alarm had sounded. And Luther Catlett went home that Sunday evening the same way he always did, as the man Harwick County trusted most. By 2020, Luther Catlett had stopped guessing and started calculating. The early days of the scheme had been cautious, small amounts, irregular timing, the kind of careful moves a person makes when they aren't sure yet if they're going to get away with it. But 2 years in, with no questions asked and no flags raised, caution started to feel unnecessary. Luther had studied his own operation the way he once studied animal care, methodically, patiently, looking for what worked and cutting out what didn't. What worked was a specific range, not too low, not too high, $40 to $90 per transaction, large enough to add up quickly across a busy weekend, small enough to disappear without a trace inside the normal flow of a high-traffic adoption day. He stopped skimming on slow Tuesdays and quiet Thursday afternoons. He ran it on holidays, on second-chance Sundays, and on the days following a viral social media post, the kind that showed a 3-legged dog finding its forever home and got shared 10,000 times before noon. Those were the days when cash flooded the front desk. Those were his days. The cruelest irony of the whole case sits right here. Every program Luther built to help animals brought more families through the door. More families meant more cash transactions. More cash transactions meant more opportunities to skim. The better he did his job publicly, the more efficiently he could rob the shelter privately. His own success became his cover. By 2021, financial investigators estimated Luther was taking between $1,200 and $1,800 every single month. The money had to go somewhere, and slowly, it did. Waverly's son had worked alongside Luther as a shelter veterinary technician for 6 years. She knew his routines, his habits, the kind of car he drove. So when Luther pulled into the parking lot one Monday morning in a brand new 2021 Ford F-250, she noticed immediately. She later told investigators exactly what went through her mind. He showed up one Monday in a 2021 F-250. I remember thinking, didn't he just say the furnace in his house needed replacing? He had said that, just a few months earlier. But the truck wasn't the only thing. Over the following year, Luther took 3 separate vacations in 14 months. He remodeled his kitchen, and in a move that was either deeply calculated or completely brazen, possibly both, he began making public donations to other animal shelters in the region. He showed up to their events. He got quoted in their press releases. He built a reputation as not just a shelter director, but a genuine community philanthropist. The board looked at all of this and saw exactly what Luther needed them to see: a dedicated, generous, flourishing leader. They were watching the story. Nobody was watching the ledger. Then came October 2022, the shelter's annual Halloween adoption event. Costumes, photos, discounted fees, the works. 340 families came through that single weekend. Based on attendance records and standard fee rates, investigators calculated that cash intake should have landed at approximately $18,700. Luther deposited $11,400. The gap was $7,300. Taken in a single weekend. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because what happens next is where this case gets genuinely complicated. 6 years of careful, calculated theft. More than 2,000 transactions. A system so quietly built that not one person inside that shelter had raised a single concern. It wasn't a forensic accountant who brought it down. It wasn't a whistleblower with a grudge or an investigative journalist chasing a tip. It wasn't even a formal audit. It was a retired school librarian who wanted a piece of paper. Thessaly Broad was 71 years old and had spent her career organizing information for a living. She was precise by habit. She drove 47 miles from Morgantown on a rainy Tuesday in November 2022 to adopt a senior cat named Fig, a 9-year-old orange tabby that most people had walked past because they wanted kittens. Thessaly wasn't most people. She paid $75 in cash at the front desk. And then, before she picked up Fig's carrier, she asked for a receipt, not an email confirmation, not a digital record sent to her phone, a paper receipt printed and handed to her because she was giving the adoption as a gift to an elderly relative and needed something physical to put in an envelope. It was such a small request, the kind made a dozen times a day at any business that handles cash. Luther printed the receipt. But he was moving quickly that afternoon, and he used the shelter's official receipt template, the formal one, the one connected directly to the master system log. The moment he hit print, the transaction auto-populated into the digital record with a timestamp, an amount, and a reference number. He walked Thessaly to the door. He went back to his afternoon. He never went back to delete the entry. That single logged transaction sat quietly in the system through the rest of November. Then December arrived, and a man named Radovan Pickett sat down to prepare the quarterly financial report. Pickett was new. He had joined the board just 3 months earlier as a volunteer treasurer, bringing with him a background in small business accounting. He wasn't looking for fraud. He was simply doing the job he'd signed up to do, matching records, checking figures, making sure the columns lined up the way they were supposed to. They didn't. The logged transaction from Thessaly Broad's visit showed $75 received. The deposit record for that week showed no such amount. Pickett flagged it quietly, assuming it was probably a clerical error. Then he looked at the week before, then the month before. Then he started going back further, and the further he went, the worse it looked. He called the state. By February 2023, the West Virginia Attorney General's office had placed 2 financial investigators on the case. They pulled every record the shelter had going back 6 years, deposit logs, event attendance sheets, volunteer sign-in schedules, and surveillance footage from the lobby camera that had been recording without anyone paying it much attention for years. What they found took weeks to fully document. 2,147 transactions with unexplained gaps between what was logged and what was deposited. Total amount missing, $95,340. And through all of it, the investigators building their case, the records being pulled, the numbers being totaled, Luther Catlett had no idea anything was happening. Until the morning they walked through his door. Ward C was the quietest part of the shelter. A long, narrow room lined with cat enclosures, smelling of cedar shavings and wet food, lit by the kind of pale light that made everything look a little softer than it actually was. Luther was in the middle of his morning feeding routine when the investigators came through the door. He had a bowl in each hand. He set them down slowly. He looked at the badge. He looked at the face behind it. And before the investigator could speak a single word, Luther Catlett asked 4 questions compressed into 4 words. Words. How bad is it? That question told the investigators almost everything they needed to know about the man standing in front of them. A person who had planned an exit would have asked for a lawyer. A person who was genuinely shocked would have asked what was happening. Luther didn't do either of those things. He asked how bad it was, because he already knew what it was. He had always known this moment was coming. He had just been living in the space between the crime and the consequence, hoping that space would last longer than it did. It lasted 6 years. Then it ended in a cat room on a weekday morning. He was placed under arrest without incident. The charges read against him were serious: 6 counts of felony embezzlement, nonprofit fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Each count carried potential prison time. Taken together, they represented the full weight of what 6 years of quiet, careful stealing actually looked like when written out in legal language. Luther didn't fight it. Within 72 hours of his arrest, his attorney contacted the West Virginia Attorney General's office with a message. Luther was willing to cooperate. What he offered turned out to be far more valuable than investigators had anticipated. Luther gave them 2 names, shelter directors working in neighboring counties, neither of whom had ever appeared in any fraud investigation before. He told investigators that both men were running cash skimming operations using methods nearly identical to his own. He described the approach as something he had heard discussed in nonprofit shelter management circles, not invented by one person, but passed around quietly among people who had figured out where the system was soft. He provided specific names, dates, transaction patterns, and enough detail to give investigators a clear starting point. Both directors were investigated. One was charged. But Luther wasn't finished. He also handed over documentation on a regional donation processing vendor, a company that provided financial software to multiple shelters across the state. According to Luther, the vendor had deliberately built its reporting interface in a way that left cash transactions easy to manipulate. The blind spots weren't accidental. They were structural. His documentation triggered a separate audit at the state level that pulled the vendor's contracts into question across several organizations. Investigators verified everything Luther provided. The names checked out. The vendor documentation held up. It put the people who arrested him in an uncomfortable position. Luther Catlett had stolen nearly $100,000 from families who loved animals. He had also just become one of the most useful cooperative witnesses they had worked with in years of nonprofit fraud cases. Both things were true at the same time. Sentencing hearings in fraud cases tend to follow a familiar pattern. The dollar figure gets read aloud. The defense argues for leniency. The prosecution argues for the full weight of the law. The judge delivers a number of months or years, and the gavel comes down. Judge Elnora Vass did not follow that pattern. When Luther Catlett stood before her in Harwick County Circuit Court, she did not open with the $95,000. She did not open with the number of transactions or the number of years. She opened with the animals. One by one, she read the names of 11 animals that had gone without scheduled veterinary procedures during the years Luther was diverting shelter funds. 11 animals whose medical care had been skipped or delayed because the budget, according to the records, simply didn't have enough money. She read their intake dates. She noted, for each one, whether they had eventually been adopted or whether they were still in the system when the investigation began. She took her time. She did not rush through the list. The courtroom was very quiet. Then she looked directly at Luther and said the words that would later be quoted in nearly every news report covering the case. You didn't steal from a corporation. You didn't steal from a government. You stole from people who believed, because you told them to believe, that their money was going to save a life. Luther said nothing. There was nothing left to say. He was sentenced to 4 years. Because of his cooperation with investigators, his clean prior record, and his full acknowledgement of guilt, that sentence was reduced to 22 months in a minimum security facility. He was ordered to pay back every dollar, the full $95,340, in restitution. His certified nonprofit administrator credentials were surrendered permanently, and he was barred for life from holding any fiduciary role at any registered nonprofit organization in the state of West Virginia. The case did not end with Luther's sentencing. In 2024, the West Virginia legislature passed the Nonprofit Accountability Act, which mandated dual-signature cash handling at all state-licensed animal welfare organizations receiving public funding. Under the new rules, no single person could process and record a cash transaction alone. Every cash payment required a second staff member present to confirm the amount before it was logged. The specific gap that Luther had exploited for 6 years, the unwatched space between cash received and cash recorded, was closed by law. The vendor Luther had identified during his cooperation did not survive the scrutiny that followed. 14 organizations across 3 states terminated their contracts after the state-level audit confirmed that the software's reporting interface had structural blind spots that made cash manipulation easier than it should have been. Luther Catlett was released from a minimum security facility in early 2025. He has not spoken publicly since his release. No interviews, no statements, no social media. The man who once gave press quotes about community and compassion and never giving up on the animals in his care has gone completely silent. Whether that silence is shame or strategy or simply exhaustion, nobody outside his immediate circle seems to know. In February 2024, the Harwick County Animal Welfare Center installed a new cash reconciliation terminal at their front intake desk. The device auto-logs every transaction the moment money changes hands. It requires a second staff member to sign off before the record is saved. Every night, without anyone having to press a button or remember a single step, it uploads the full day's cash activity directly to the board's oversight dashboard. It costs $3,400. Let that sit for a moment. Luther Catlett spent 6 years stealing $95,340 from grieving families, hopeful families, families who drove across county lines because they believed in what that shelter stood for. He built a careful, patient, almost invisible operation that touched more than 2,000 transactions and went undetected through 6 annual reviews. And the fix cost $3,400. That gap between how much damage was done and how simple the solution turned out to be is the part of this case that is hardest to shake, because it means the loophole was never complicated. It was never technical. There was no sophisticated fraud, no elaborate network, no system that required special knowledge to crack. The loophole was human. It was built entirely out of trust. It was the quiet, collective assumption that a man who genuinely loved animals, who wept at adoption events, who stayed late on weeknights to bottle feed newborn kittens that had been abandoned on the shelter's doorstep, who gave newspaper interviews about second chances and community responsibility, could not possibly also be the person slowly emptying the account those same animals depended on. That assumption was the vulnerability, not the software, not the ledger format, not the annual review schedule. The belief that goodness in one area of a person's life makes them trustworthy in all the others. That was the open door. And Luther Catlett walked through it, calmly and repeatedly, for 6 straight years. Every shelter director in West Virginia who handles a cash transaction today does it differently than they did before this case. Not because someone rewrote the technology from the ground up. Because one small printed receipt, generated in a hurry on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, for a woman who simply wanted documentation she could put in an envelope, pulled a single loose thread that unraveled everything. Thessaly Broad still has Fig. The 9-year-old orange tabby that most people had walked past is reportedly doing well, comfortable, unhurried, and completely unaware of the chaos his adoption paperwork set in motion. Thessaly herself has no idea that she is the reason Luther Catlett's name now lives in a criminal database. She drove 47 miles, asked for a receipt, and went home. Sometimes that's all it takes. A habit, a standard request, one person in the right place who simply wanted the paperwork to be correct. If this case changed the way you think about where your donation money actually goes, you're not alone. Most people never ask. Maybe they should start.